After the massacre, the whites that were left in Ocoee schemed with the local courts to have the land ownership transferred to them. Over 330 acres of land was stolen that day in 1920. Land worth over $5 million today. But this land taking wasn't an anomaly. Land was a priority for black families after the Civil War, when nearly 4 million people were freed from slavery. In 1865, just before emancipation, the Union Army General Sherman met with 20 black ministers in Savannah, Georgia, and asked them what they needed. In resounding unison, they claimed that land was what they needed to move on from slavery. General Sherman issued a special order declaring that 400,000 acres formerly held by Confederates be given to African Americans, what became known as the promise of 40 acres and a mule. Obviously, the promise never materialized, but near the end of Reconstruction, a new group of black landowners were establishing themselves. Many had experience in the fields, and they began buying farms and land throughout the South. By 1920, African Americans made up 10% of the population, but represented 14% of all Southern landowners. Because of the wealth accumulation in the black community, a white supremacist backlash swelled throughout the South. The terrorism, the violence, the lynchings instituted by poor whites toward blacks during this time period. It wasn't about race, it wasn't about skin color, or some arbitrary story of a black man whistling at a white woman that sparked some race riot. The violence was about black wealth. And that's why I believe that there's a legitimate claim for reparations, not just for the pain and suffering, the generational trauma, the forced labor with no pay that was inflicted on blacks for hundreds of years, not even for the actual calculable, documented wealth theft that was supported by governments and the courts throughout this country, but because I don't believe we can achieve true reconciliation until a wrong is made right. As a state senator, I filed a bill for reparations for the descendants of the Ocoee Massacre. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this matter. Thanks for listening. Until next time.
All right. Hey, welcome to the Soapboxx podcast. I'm your host, TJ Legacy. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I have the distinct honor of interviewing, speaking to State Senator Randolph Bracy. How you doing, State Senator?
I'm excellent, TJ. I'm honored to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate that. So I didn't know you were into podcasting until I did my research. I didn't know if you're trying to take my job. You already have a job. So what made you, my first question off that is, do I have anything to worry about, and what made you get into podcasting?
No, I think your job is safe, man. I'm just staying in my own lane. Just talking about things I care about. But you on another level, so your job is safe. But what I said is that I just really felt strongly about some certain issues, especially race. I mean, I think it's time to talk about it. I started it before the protest and all of this conversation around race started, but I just felt it was time. It's something I wanted to talk about, and so I thought a podcast was the platform to do it.
Absolutely. I think podcast is definitely the new wave. You know, I always look at Black consciousness as a journey. Like we're never fully finished. We're always kind of continuously to cultivate our consciousness. Was the Ocoee Massacre in July Perry, do you attribute your research in diving into the massacre as, your tipping point in your enlightenment for Black consciousness, or was it something else?
Well, no, I would just say, my family talks about race, about cultural issues. They're all very conscious, and so this is something I kind of just grew up in. It's kind of the backdrop of why I run for office. But the Ocoee July Perry story is interesting. I really didn't know about it until I moved. So I got elected and moved to Ocoee. Mm-hmm. And the more I just got into the story, the more I felt strongly about it. I think about 2 years ago, Congress started to talk about reparations. And as the 100th year anniversary was approaching, I just decided I wanted to do something to, one, get the story of July Perry, Ocoee Massacre out, because it's such a compelling story. I mean, to this day, it's still the bloodiest day in American political history. It happened on presidential election day. And so it happened right here in Central Florida, and not many people, even in Central Florida, didn't know about it. And so I thought the story needed to be told, but I thought it was also a way to have a conversation about reparations. And it's uncomfortable for people, but I thought this was the way to open that conversation.
Well, and I definitely appreciate that, and I think your district appreciates that as well. I always wanted to, ask, how do you toe the fine line? Because we're now in a political climate where we're having a discussion between symbolism and substance, right? And so, but you took it a step forward to actually introduce legislation, the Ocoee Massacre Education Bill, where you could have easily just, did what the typical politician does, which is, hey, maybe have, a ceremony just to give some streamers some whistles to say, hey, I did something. But you took it a step further to put pen to paper and draft legislation. What was your thought process in doing that, as far as making sure that there was substance behind the legislation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would just say I'm not really a politician. I came here to do stuff, and so I engaged the Senate president well before our legislative session, and just started talking to him about the Ocoee Massacre. I've been in the process long enough to know how something can get done. And so I just started engaging the major players and just said, listen, we're approaching the 100th year anniversary. I think it's important that we acknowledge what the state's role in this massacre. And I think it would be fitting in the 100th year anniversary if we passed a bill and made some substantive change. And so he was for it. And so the reparations portion of the bill was more controversial, but I got the buy-in of the Senate president who runs the Senate. And so he's a major player. And with him on board, then it started the ball rolling.
Why do you believe in this? May, it's not a rhetorical question. I know the answer, but I want you to articulate it. Why, to someone who is watching this, why would they believe that, with all the history, with your articulation of the history of the Ocoee Massacre, why would reparations be such a controversial a controversial topic? You were stated in the Florida Phoenix, you said they have basically, I'm paraphrasing, but you said that Republicans have a concern with having their names attached to reparations for African Americans. Some people are concerned about the political fallout. Why do you think that it's such a, if we look at especially in the current climate, we look at the Jewish Holocaust survivors, a lot of these other interest groups have gotten some form of reparations. Why is the reparations part, in your estimation, so difficult for people to understand?
That's a deep question. I think that our country has had such a dark past when it comes to African Americans. And so, I mean, when you talk about paying any kind of financial payment to African Americans, I think that gets to some people, and so I think it goes back to our history, and politically speaking, I think it's still a difficult topic for some people on the other side of the aisle to embrace. And so I just think even in the Democratic Party circles, it's still becoming an accepted idea. It's just becoming an accepted idea. You heard it talked about in the debates, and so it's an idea that I think is gaining momentum, but it doesn't have widespread support yet. But I think it goes back to our history. We have issues with African Americans and progressing. I mean, if you look at the story of Jalot Perry, a lot of the history surrounds the voting piece of it. But this man, he employed white people and Black people. I mean, he was a wealthy man. And that's what I tried to talk about in the podcast, that it was really the wealth accumulation that is what got to the people in Ocoee 100 years ago. And so I think some of the vestiges of the past are still there in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So and I agree. And I think I've always been one of those people that says we live in a system of white supremacy. In Florida, to your testament, has a history of racialized violence, and where you are a legislator in a predominantly Republican run Florida legislature. So how is it that you are able to reach across the aisle and get this bill done as far as the education portion? And I want you to talk to people about that. But how do you get things done and represent for your people, being a Democrat, knowing that you're facing an uphill battle?
Well, how you get something like that done in the legislature? I'm a pragmatist. I've developed relationships with Republicans, but I'm still true to myself and what I believe. And so I just simply reach out to people, try to be honest and genuine, and say, hey, this is important. And I need your help on it. I think sometimes when you come out combative right from the gate, it gets people defensive. I try to disarm people and just talk to them, as brothers and sisters, human beings. And so I think it's served me well in the legislature, and that's how it's worked. But even with all of that said, you can still do all the right things, and sometimes politics trump good policy. But this was something that it just worked out in my favor, and so I'm just happy to be a part of it. The family was happy, and I'm glad that I was able to do it. So I hope that answered your question.
No, it did. I was just seeing if maybe you could give some of these other legislators some advice, because a lot of times, and I think in predominantly African American districts, we're always told what our elected officials can't do. Oh, well, it's a Republican legislature, so I can't really get anything passed or get anything through, and it's used that as an excuse. And it's almost like, well, you knew that before you ran, that it was going to be dominated by one particular party. But you were able to navigate the waters in order to do something that is really unapologetically Black. So I wanted to know if you wanted to share any of your secret sauce, as if you would, to any of these legislators or anybody who aspires to be a legislator.
Yeah. Well, I will say that the fact that Republicans control the House, the Senate, the governor's mansion, that is a real roadblock. So the fact that I was able to have a successful session, I did work hard, but it's not to diminish any other legislators. I know.
Of course, no.
Yeah, you know what I mean? So, but again, I mean, that's what I would say. I think I'm in a unique position. The Senate is much different than the House. And so the Senate works in a way where Democrats and Republicans work together a lot better. In the House, it's a lot more contentious. Democrats don't have as much power. And I mean that respectfully. It's just, I've served in the House, so I could say that from experience. And so, like, just to give you an example, when I got to the Senate, I was named chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee. I set policy for the entire state on criminal justice matters, a committee that heard the most bills or heard the most pieces of legislation more than any other committee, and it was given to a Democrat. And so it's a function of I think my reputation of working with people, but also a function of the Senate too. The Senate works a little bit different than the House, and so once you can get something moving in the Senate, then and then because we're the upper chamber, I can talk to leaders in the House, even Republican leaders, and they'll work with you because there's things that they want in the Senate. It's a complicated process, but
it's a lot of give and take.
Yeah,
a lot of give and take. Okay, I absolutely get it. It's I think there's an educational component to what's going on currently in the political climate with the unrest and the supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement, and really educating on ignorance. We're having a lot of these, different conversations. Do you feel like the miseducation has contributed to this unrest? Do you feel like it's having more legislation like this where people are forced to learn more about the history, not just of our forefathers, but learning the actual history of white supremacy and racism in order to move forward?
I think a bill like this does good. I think people need to learn the history. I've heard so many people say that I didn't even know about this history. White people have said that. So I think it does contribute to having meaningful dialogue, and that's what I've wanted. I think, and that's how I've approached, again, how I've dealt with other legislators. There weren't many at all who even knew about this story. And, as you talk and try to educate people, that's how things move forward. And so I think it's important to have these discussions. It's important to have bills like this because I think it moves the ball forward.
Yeah. Switching gears. Right now we're in the midst of a pandemic, right? We're trying, and school years almost, is vastly approaching. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you feel like it's safe for the kids to get to go back to school in August? And what provisions would you like to see if they did return?
I don't know if we're safe yet. And I'm having conversations with some of my colleagues in the legislature. The governor has made a decision, but I don't think it's safe. I know there's a lot of concern from parents about school opening, and so I think we need to have a little bit more caution. I think we were in a rush to open back up the economy, and so I would go back to that. I think if we had a stronger,
you would go back to phase one.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is if we had a stronger unemployment system, you still have people who haven't been paid unemployment. And so I'm just going to go even back to that, where if we had a strong system where people could be compensated while they're out of work, we wouldn't have to rush back, or the governor wouldn't have to feel rushed back to open back up the economy. So I think we have some structural problems that we need to deal with so that we can prepare for a crisis like this. And I just don't think that it's been handled correctly. So, but it's just as far as the school opening, I think I don't know if we're ready, to be honest.
Yeah. What would you give Governor Ron DeSantis if you were to give him a grade on his handling of the COVID-19? What would you give him of the pandemic for the state?
Yeah, I would say C minus, maybe even lower than that. I think.
So he would need summer school.
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure. Okay. I think he's taking his cues from President Trump. That's really what he's doing. And so we need someone to be a leader on their own and make those decisions and not have to take their cue from the president.
Yeah, I know you wrote a letter to Governor DeSantis, and you were trying to start a special session for police police reform, and I appreciate, we talked offline, of course, and I appreciate you doing that. What made you take that stand? It's a bold stance, because you not only wrote a letter, but you have your 10 reform proposals for police accountability and for police reform. What made you take that stand?
Well, I mean, it was shortly after the George Floyd murder, but it was so heart-wrenching, and I felt like the attention of the country was there. I just thought the momentum was there. And these are proposals that have been proposed before, but I thought the moment was right, and I was looking for some buy-in with the Republican Party for them to acknowledge that, police brutality is an issue, and we need to address it and not push the ball down the road. Because really, if we wait, more people could be killed. I mean, and I mean this sincerely, because I
agree
believe,
with you.
Yeah, and I wanted to say that I believe they're good police, and so people get uncomfortable and pick sides when you talk about police brutality, but and so I believe that they're good police, and so I want to say that. But I do believe that there needs to be some accountability measures in place to hold some officers accountable.
I always am taken aback when elected officials or anyone who's addressing the police publicly, when they talk about accountability, how they say, "Oh, there's good police." Like, I always feel like, I always do. I don't know why everybody does it. Like, even if someone were talking about, COVID-19 or doctors or holding them accountable, we don't, there's good doctors out here. But it's like, why is there such a stigma when it comes to police accountability, that it's an attack on a police? Shouldn't they want it to be better? Why is it perceived automatically as an attack that people have to put in? Really, it's like everybody has to put an asterisk by their critiques of trying to make a system better. Yeah,
and that's really what I was doing. I'm so used to comments being misconstrued that you have to just couch your statements and say, "Hey, I'm not against all police." And so I guess it's sad that you have to do that. I can't really say why. Why?
I always look at it like, if you say, "Oh, I'm not against all police," as if what you're going to say after that, they're going to be like, "Oh, I understand. Oh, I'm with you. I get everything you're saying. I'm totally agree." It's like anytime they say, "Hey, I'm with the police," it's like, but, and then you go on to do things that they're going to be mad with you about anyway. Yeah, so it's like,
you might as well just
you might as well just skip it and just say, "This is what I really feel."
I'm working on that.
Yeah, man, they'll be all right. They're going through their own, things. But I look at some, like a story like Nick Cannon, right? Nick Cannon came out and he's all in the news, and he came out and he made some controversial statements that some view as anti-Semitic, some view as being, someone who's enlightened or, trying to be pro-black. But I want to, like, where do you toe that line where it comes to, okay, I want to say something, but getting that backlash in this current climate of cancel culture and everybody's trying to ask for everybody's resignation? Like, it's like, do you feel handcuffed as an elected official in order to speak up? Do you fear any of that backlash, especially when you talk about things like police accountability?
I guess for me, I've been doing this long enough where I've just decided I gotta say what I feel, and I gotta be me. And so that doesn't mean not to be respectful of other cultures, but I'm gonna say what I believe. And so and I'm gonna put forth the legislation that I believe is important. And that's just what it is. And so hopefully people will recognize the work that I do, what I stand for, and respect it. But I'm not going to try to be something I'm not.
No, no, I definitely I respect that. There is some measures on the proposal. I do want to go down the list and ask, and ask your get your take on it, get you to elaborate on on your thought process. So when you said let me go down the list. I'm going to jump around if you don't mind.
Sure.
Number two, it says, straight out. Well, I like number one. Let me just say that. Number one, police must be investigated by an independent agency, not by a local police agency. I think that's just common sense, right?
I would think so. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about excessive force cases, internal affairs, a department housed in the police force they all work together. So I don't think it's appropriate. I think it's a conflict of interest.
Yeah. And then you talk about in number two, it says, revise the police bill of rights. And so the police bill of rights gives them near full immunity for any act that they may commit. And so, I was of the impression, I was like, yeah, well, we need to revise, or shouldn't we just be working on, and I know it's, a straight repeal, because we can't really reform something that's broken. Don't we have to kind of reconstruct it? What are your thoughts on repeal rather than revise as far as the police bill of rights, knowing what that police officers pretty much have impunity?
Yeah, repeal, I don't know. I mean, there are some decent protections. Maybe it would be worthwhile. I just don't think that it's plausible at this point. I don't think it's going to happen. Knowing the makeup of the legislature, knowing the influence that these police unions have, I don't think it's plausible to do. So I just look at what can be done, and so I think there are some tweaks that can be made to make things better.
Yeah. What are those, when you say there are some decent protections? What are those that maybe the community is not aware of, that there are some decent protections of the police bill of rights?
It's just I think and I'm not an expert on this, but just the arbitration that happens between the police and the unions when a shooting happens, for an example. I think it leans very heavily toward the police unions. And so I think that there are some things that can be done that can be put in place so that it's really an independent arbiter, so that it doesn't lean one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, how do you, as far as these, and you mentioned these police unions and their influence, just how, I don't think people really grasp how influential police unions are. They think police unions, they're just in a hall and, maybe having some baked goods, maybe some juice or something, and they're just, hanging around their cop buddies. But how influential in Tallahassee are these police unions when it comes to crafting legislation?
They come to Tallahassee, they lobby the legislature, and they just have tremendous power, especially, I would say, in Republican districts where it's important to have like a law and order stance. You don't want to be known for going against the police unions. I'm trying to think, the Sheriff's Association.
You're on the wrong show, because I do it all the time, but I'm not a legislator.
Yeah. I mean, as a Democrat, I don't mind challenging them. And as the chairman of the Criminal Justice Committee, when I had so many different reforms, I mean, they didn't like most of them, and so I saw them in my office all the time talking about how they had a problem with some of the reforms that I had. So even what
some of those reforms, like what would you try to do that you felt like was a good compromise that maybe a police union they didn't necessarily agree with?
Here's one thing that really just didn't even make sense. I mean, so for an example, just getting rid of certain mandatory minimums. I believe a judge can make the appropriate decision to sentence a person, but the police unions would come and fight against mandatory minimums. And I always thought, like, okay, your job is to arrest, and then the lawmakers will decide how a person should be sentenced, or at least we give that discretion to the judge. And so the fact that they, do their job arresting people, but also try to make legislative decisions on how long a person should stay in there. And what they always say is, these long sentences are deterrents, but that's just not factual. The facts do not bear that. Most people, you talk to any person that did a crime, they didn't know exactly how long the sentence would carry. And not to excuse any crime, but I'm just saying that's just one example of something they were against.
You brought up there's a proposal where you said there should be this proposal will mandate officer training of implicit bias and de-escalation. Florida has a history of, like you attested, of racial violence. It's been well documented that white supremacist groups have infiltrated many law enforcement agencies across the country, even in Florida. We can't negate that fact. How do we train out the white supremacy out of somebody's heart in order to make it safe for the public?
Well, you can't legislate someone's heart, but I think you can put in accountability measures so that a person can't treat someone unfairly with impunity. And I think that's really been my approach. Implicit bias training is important, but I think it has to be coupled with certain accountability measures so that, the law protects people.
But wouldn't that, so if they have implicit bias training, that would mean they would need more resources, more funds. And you're hearing now many peaceful protesters, there's different pockets of protesters that say they want to reallocate funds to social workers. They want to reallocate funds to, they want to defund the police. Where do you stand on that spectrum? Because implicit bias training, giving them more training, officers more resources, it's almost like they're getting more funds, and that's something that the public, I think I would say the majority of the public really doesn't want to see happen. So how do you sell that?
How do you sell what in particular? I was on to defund the police.
The increase of funds to for implicit bias training.
Well, I think it's important to have it in statute. We give a lot of money toward police training, and so I think these monies can be moved around for what's important. And so I think that would be something of importance. So I think it's just a matter of priority. The state has the money to fund an initiative like that. It's just, is it a priority? So I just think it's a matter of just putting the money in the right places.
Yeah. And I like what I couldn't have said it better myself. Number 7, it says, everybody knows the extensive work I've done as far as police citizen review boards. Why do you feel like it's important? How do you sell that point to across the aisle, Republican legislators, that why is it important to have an independent citizen review board with some teeth power? Yeah, with some teeth.
I don't think that you just have to have accountability. I keep saying that word, but that's what it comes down to. If you have a citizen review board and it doesn't have any teeth, I think it's symbolic. I don't think it does much. And so what's the point of doing it if it doesn't have some teeth to it? And that's my thought on it. And so that's a conversation that I look forward to having in Tallahassee. I think it's pretty simple. What's the point of having it if there's no teeth in it?
No, I agree. And I think, but that's always been the idea of citizen review boards, specifically here in Orlando, where it's just a lot of things that are just cosmetic, right? So It's just a lot of, we want to give the illusion of your input, but we don't actually, want your input. I want to get your thoughts on, there was a story that came out, State Attorney Aaron Masayala here, Osceola in Orange County, 9th Judicial Circuit, came out with the Brady's list. And the Brady's list basically has a bunch of officers on, in layman's terms, a bunch of officers that are listed who are red flags, so to speak, with not being credible. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Is that's something I wanted to propose, where as one of our points out there as activists, that these officers who have a history of excessive force should be publicized. I believe it should be happen quarterly. Some people have it, think it should be happen monthly. What are your thoughts on publishing, making these things more public as a deterrent to other officers? And do you feel like, let me just start with that. What do you think of having this as a deterrent?
That's an interesting concept, and I would like to explore that thought a little bit. I would just ask, what, other than a deterrent to other officers, what else would be the goal of doing that? And I'm open to it. I'm just trying to understand it.
Yeah, I would like to understand, and maybe that's something I could, one day I'll have the opportunity to ask State Attorney Anderson Ayala. But in your opinion, if someone who's a law enforcement officer is not deemed a credible witness to a crime, why do they have their job?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with what State Attorney Ayala did in releasing those names.
But my thing is why should they, it should go a step further. If you're not suitable to be a credible witness to a crime, which means you really can't make any arrests without someone questioning, any sort of, wrongdoing or malfeasance or whatever. So why should you're basically out there just being a paperweight, because you're just patrolling, but you can't really do anything because it's going to come into question and make another agency's job harder. So that comes into the part of accountability. So, why should these officers have their jobs if they can't be a credible witness?
I would agree. With that. You make a great point. I don't know how you mandate that. At this point, I guess it's up to the individual police units to decide if they keep that person or not. But I think that's a credible point. Should they be an officer still?
Yeah, because they do. I think they absolutely do. They're compromising investigations, because I think the misconception is with activists, we don't want, some people saying they don't want police wear, but we don't want crime in our communities, right? And so if this officer who's supposed to be there and protect and serve, because we have to differentiate between the officers who are serving our communities valiantly and those who are racially targeting, using the law enforcement uniform to racially target and harm people in marginalized communities, right? And so when you look at that, you're saying, well, if someone breaks into my house, but then this officer on the Brady list shows up and he does the investigation, then I'm not going to receive any justice. That's my understanding of it, because it's going to be harder for me to attain that justice in order. So I just think that with legislators and elected officials, I think they need to understand that, when we identify, I think that's the problem. Don't you think? Like, when we identify who the quote unquote, and I hate using this analogy and people are going to kill me. I won't even say it. When we identify the officers who have a history of misconduct and excessive force, right? What's the process of actually getting them out? Because a lot of these officers are still patrolling and they have their jobs. So what do we suggest? How do we find, like you said, it's crunch time. How do we find a mechanism to hold them accountable with this police Bill of Rights hovering over our heads, with helping them evade accountability?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the Police Bill of Rights, and I think that's where the protections are. And so when there is a situation where these police chiefs want to let go of them, it's difficult to do because of the arbitration that happens between sheriff's office and the police unions. And so that's where I think the change needs to happen, so that when there is misconduct, the sheriff's office or the city of Orlando or what have you has the capacity to let these officers go, because you've seen it before where they let them go, and then the because of the arbitration and because it leans toward the police unions, that person is right back on the force. So that's where I think the change needs to happen.
You know, in switching gears, you mentioned, you know, your parents are very instrumental in how you cultivated your consciousness. You know, your father is world renowned, Dr. Bracy, you know, in the church. I wanted to ask you, you grew up in the church, as did I. What is your view of the Black church's role in the modern day civil rights movement, as opposed to when your parents grew up? Do you feel like, should they be doing more?
I think the church has a role. I look to my pastor, who is very vocal, and he's using social media to really talk about these issues. He has a lot of influence with other pastors, white congregations. He speaks all over the country, the world, really. And so he has been using his platform to speak honestly. And I think that the Black church should be doing that. They should be speaking honestly, and also finding what their role is in making things better. And so I think the Black church has always played a role in the movements, the civil rights movement, and so I think we have a role. The Black church has a role also today. And I think a church should find where they fit in. I think my church is very active in what we're doing, even though it's all online, but I think it's important.
Do you believe there's a disconnect between, the youth? Like, we hear a lot of those conversations when it comes to, juvenile crime. They say, oh, the kids just don't have anything to do. But, when we're seeing images depicted on the news, kids, and I wouldn't say kids, the youth, they're watching the news. They're seeing it. They're on TikTok. They're on social media. You see, they just ruined Trump's rally in Tulsa by using social media. So they're active. However, when it comes to the church, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect in ideology as how to progress forward in the modern day civil rights movement. It just seems like do you believe that there's a disconnect between the Black Lives Matter movement and how let's say the John Lewis's that regeneration? Do you think there's a difference in ideology of how we attain justice and freedom?
I think there is. I think that I think the older generation doesn't quite understand this younger generation. I think this younger generation is not really going to stand for what they're seeing, and so they have a different approach. And I just think that happens, every generation. You have a younger generation that has to move things forward, and so I think there is a little bit of a disconnect. I think there's also like a technological difference, where they may not know necessarily where to engage, or because that's where a lot of the conversations are happening. And so maybe they're having them, but they don't have the presence on social media. The young people do, so you may not hear them as much, but I think they're watching. And I think there has to have to be a coming together of different generations. But there's a disconnect. I would say so.
Yeah. How do we bridge that? How do we bridge that gap? What do you think? How do we bridge that gap to make sure that we get? I've always looked at the civil rights movement as then, now, and forever. Like, we have to honor those from our past. We have to do the work in the present, and then we have to make sure that the work that we're doing benefits those who we will pass the torch to. So how do we bridge that? Because you got one saying one wants to defund the police, and the other one is just like, oh, wait a minute, we just need to sit down and pray and take a knee, and we shall overcome. And so how do we bridge that gap? And I'm asking you this question because you're a fairly young legislature, right? Well, I'm 33. We're in that same bracket, right? And so what are those sort of nuggets or solutions of someone who can I think galvanize, you know, I look at you as potentially someone that can galvanize both generations, right? Because you understand, you come from that background. So what are your ways of maybe bridging that gap?
Well, I appreciate you put me in that bracket. But yeah, no, I think that the older generation is looking to the younger generation to see, you know, what are they going to do? They've got this conversation started with the protests, but I think they're in a wait and see mode. Like, okay, are you all going to vote? Because I think the older generation has been around enough to know what is going to make the actual change. And so I think they feel like you've got a generation who's making a lot of noise, but isn't really willing to put in the work. I mean, when you look at the civil rights movement of the past, they had a direct goal that they were working toward, and that's how it was effective. And so you're seeing the energy, you're seeing the social media presence, but I think the older generation is looking for a direction or a goal that we can put this energy towards. And so I think that's how you bridge the gap. If you have a mass of people, young people that show up, then I think the older people will follow and they'll get behind it, and we'll see the change we want to see.
No, I think there's some there's definitely some truth to that, because right now, you know, even when I take a step back and I look at, and I study James Baldwin is a heavy influence on mine, Malcolm X, you know, Marcus Garvey, you know, I study their speeches and stuff. But when it's one thing to learn from that generation, from the civil rights generation and those icons, and understanding our history. But then we see, like, it's almost like we're running in parallel lines, the two generations, right? And everyone's and they're still trying to race and run with the younger folks who have a lot of energy, and it's just like they're like, oh, we have a better way, but we're really compete. It's almost like in the civil rights movement is a competition. It's we're competing against each other to say, oh, I got a better way, and I always look at it as, you know, trying to teach the older generation that we don't have to, the younger generation, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But then trying to teach the older generation, well, we do have AC, we do have GPS, so we have some technology we can put into the car in order to get to our destination. We don't need to bring out the big old map. We can just ask Siri what we need to do, right? So, you know, that's always been my thought process. But speaking of movements, I wanted to ask you, there's always been this progressive movement, right? You hear these, you know, young progressives. However, to me, it's always seemed like it's an exclusion of black progressives, because we're all young progressives until it's a social justice issue that it's like, all right, Black folks, when you guys get finished with that issue, you guys can come on and hop on board. So now we have the older generation, we have the younger generation, and then we have the ideological, you know, political ideologies when it comes to the young progressives and the Black progressives. Even do you have a relationship with those who are consider themselves young progressives in the legislature, and how do you cultivate those relationships?
Yeah, I'm here for the new ideology of these new progressives, and so I'm learning too. And so you've got a wave of them coming in the legislature. You had some new people come in last session, and I think the more you're seeing across the country this unrest, these conversations happening, it's inspiring a generation of younger people that are running for office. And so you've got people across this state who are progressives, who are brilliant young people that I think have a lot to contribute to the conversation that happens in Tallahassee. And so I'm excited. I try to align myself with them, because even though I have the experience, I'm still young enough to have some of the same perspectives. So I'm here for it, and I'm ready to work with them.
I know we mentioned that we're in a pandemic. How has your district been hit by COVID-19, and speak to any of the some of the efforts that you've done to maybe alleviate some of the stress and pressure on your district.
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. What we've tried to do is try to provide just assistance. We've had food distributions maybe about every 2 weeks almost. We had on average 2 a year before. I think we've had maybe close to 15 since the pandemic because the need was there. And then we've also fielded so many calls regarding unemployment that our office has just been dedicated toward dealing with and making sure people get their unemployment. So I traveled to Tallahassee, spoke directly with the DEO director, their staff, and I made sure I took my staff to make sure that there was a direct line of communication so that when we get these inquiries, I want my district to go right to the front of the line so that they can get their claims processed. And it's sad that we have a system that's so janky, but that's just what it is. And so we've tried to make the best of a bad situation. And that's really it. We just try through social media to inform people on just updates, numbers, COVID numbers. I mean, just as they come, as we get them, we just try to be an avenue to get that information out.
How would you say that we can make predominantly African American districts more economically viable and have independent freedom? Because a lot of times when we have these business grants or this funding, it's a lot of minority. It's the trickle down, but it's not specifically for Black communities. And minority can mean Asian community, and minority can mean white women. Minority can mean a plethora of things. How do we make sure that the money that's being allocated from Tallahassee are going directly to the Black community and Black businesses so that we can have a thriving community and create jobs?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I was the sponsor of the appropriation that went to our private HBCUs. And so it was historic in nature. And that's another thing that I had worked on well before our legislative session, working with the Bethune-Cookman leadership, board of trustee. But anyway, we got a historic
you're gonna tell a rattler that you just gave BCU some money.
Y'all at state school, and we always take care of y'all. And so
got you.
We gotta show Bethune some love.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, though, they were in some trouble, some financial troubles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought it was important that we save our HBCU. So that's one way to make sure that we put out a group of college educated students and make sure that they're well funded. The schools are well funded so that we continue to put out generations of young Black people that can sustain themselves. But also, I mean, you're going to have the challenges when it comes to appropriations for Black businesses. I mean, that's something that I've tried, and it's difficult, and until I think control switches hands or switches parties, to see substantial numbers of money going into the Black community will be difficult. But I think what we've seen in these last couple of months, where you've seen Black businesses supporting each other and this Buy Black initiatives, I think if we start to really support each other, I think that's where we have a lot of power. And so I would like for it to be more than just like a day or, Black out there or what have you. I just think it needs to be a concept that we champion. It's something that I thought about having like a press conference on, just like an initiative. When my proposals were denied by the governor and the Senate president to have a special session, I've actually started a voting initiative. But I also think that if you affect the state economically, where people start to pay attention and we start to use our buying power to influence decisions, I think we can really use that power and make a change. So that's a thought, and it's something that I think we need to continue to explore within our own community.
Yeah, no, I do, and I think that's something that we need to continuously put pressure on. And I think your conversation that you've presented in the legislature of hey, reparations needs to be something that is an ongoing topic, and I think a part of that is the economics part and making sure that those reparations or that those resources go directly to Black communities so that they can thrive. I do want to talk to you about this. You're a pretty even keel guy. I don't think I've ever seen you like upset or
Right.
what are you? Does anything get you like up and down? I'm a passionate guy. I talk with my hands. I'm originally from up north, so what does anything either get you upset, rile you up, like, or is this just you the whole like all the way?
Yeah, I'm chill. I'm pretty laid back. You see my family.
Yeah.
See my dad, he's like the opposite. My sister is like my dad. They have big personalities. My mom and I we're like the thinkers. We sit in the back in the cut and just watch and just plan and strategize and figure things out. And that's me.
I've seen your mom a couple times and she just looks at me and just gives me that.
Yeah. Hey.
She gives me that like, don't you even come over here, but I know you exist, and I know.
Yeah, people have said that. You're not the first person to say that.
Yeah.
She's always.
We never cross paths or any opposition, but I just every time she looks at me, I look at her, and it's just like I'm aware of you, you're aware of me. We're good to go.
Hey.
Yeah.
She won't bite. Yeah.
No.
Let me give her a plug real quick though.
Okay, go ahead.
She wrote a book about her experience integrating the public school system in Alachua County. She was the very first person to do that. And so when you talk about these things that I've been doing, I get it honestly from my mom and dad. But she wrote a children's book about it, about her experience. And so she's made history, really. She's a trailblazer in that, right? And so since you mentioned her, I just wanted to give her a shout out.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah,
And maybe she'll come on the Soapboxx one day. That would be interesting. We're always looking to bridge that gap. So we need that generation on here as well to give them a bigger platform. So
absolutely.
I do want to ask you, speaking of making history, so Congresswoman Val Demings is a vice presidential hopeful to Joe Biden. If she gets selected, and then in November, if she wins, then there's an open seat in her district.
Right.
Could we see a Bracy for Congress run if that happens?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. I just would say that Congresswoman Demings is an excellent choice. I know her personally. I think she's an excellent representative for this area. And so I'd like to see it, just because I think I would be proud just to have a VP candidate right here in Central Florida representing our state and our community. But I also think she's just an excellent representative. She's done a great job being there in DC. And so I hope she's picked. And if she was, I'm not going to speak on it. I have no comment.
You gave a big smile when I said it, so we're gonna.
I knew where you were going. I knew where you were going.
We're gonna play this. We're gonna play this back whenever if it does happen and she does win. But I think that's something that you maybe you should if you haven't considered it. I'm sure that it's in your thought process. Have you ever thought about like where do you, as far as you're a senator now, but have you thought about other aspirations, because eventually you'll be turned out. So is that something that's in the back of your mind?
Yeah, I just told you, my mom and I, we're the thinkers, we're the planners. So, I'm always watching. But I think that, how I became a senator was just opportunity. You had Senator Geraldine Thompson, who vacated the seat to run for Congress, and an opportunity open. When I first ran, it was an open seat because of redistricting. that 8 years ago. So I think that opportunities come, and you just want to be prepared for it and pray about it and make sure you're making the right decision.
All right. Well, there's a segment on the Soapboxx that we do every episode. It's called the moral of the story. It's basically your time, your minute and a half to summarize the conversation that we had, put a bow on it, or to plug anything that you would like the public to know about. So I'm just going to give you the floor and, ask you, Senator Bracy, what's your moral of the story?
I would say the moral of the story is to vote. But with all that we talked about reparations, we talked about police reform, but for those things to happen, we need people to vote. And so I know you have a following, but I think if everyone can use their influence with the people they know to register people, and by the way, Monday is the last day to register for this primary. And so you need to be registered. It takes 5 minutes online. You've got some local races like the state attorney's race that is extremely important. But the point is, you've got to use your voice to vote. And if you want to see the change that you've been seeking to happen, that's how it happens. And so I would just encourage everyone to use their voice and vote in this election. That's including young people. We need you to step up in this election because it's important and it's crucial. And we're depending on you all really to make the difference. I'll just go back to real quickly of Andrew Gillum, who last 2 years ago when he ran, I mean, it was 30,000 votes that separated the election. So that's just one example, but it happens all the time, where if we had a group of people that decided that they're going to make a difference, it will matter. And so that's my moral of the story.
State Senator Randolph Bracy, thank you so much for being a part of the Soapboxx. You're welcome back anytime. I know offline we do speak, but I definitely appreciate you supporting independent Black media because it's needed. And so just you being on here is definitely a plus, and look forward to more conversations with you and following your career as time goes on.
Thanks, TJ. I appreciate it. I'm glad to support. Have a good one.
No problem. All right, y'all. That was State Senator Randolph Bracy. Appreciate y'all. This is the Soapboxx podcast. Peace.